Welcome to DCOM Network, where I design and develop software and share my knowledge with you. We're going to talk about Entity Framework today and validation and how we can recover from errors that happen when we try to save and persist changes and things of that nature. So I'm going to talk about a couple best practices to use. I'm going to guide you through those, and we're also going to talk about a couple things that I feel don't get talked about when you're learning to use Entity Framework. Even if you've been using Entity Framework for a long time, a couple years, I still feel that there's a couple areas that you really don't know much about until someone either explains it to you or you run across a problem in depth and you have to find the answer. So those are the things that we're going to talk about. Now before I continue, I just want to let you know that if you hear some mechanical noises such as printing, I am cleaning the print heads on an HP printer I'm having issues with, and it's unfortunately a time-consuming process, and I really wanted to do this video tonight, so we'll kind of have to deal with that and work through it. But let's start in Visual Studio, and we're going to create a new, just a console application with Entity Framework 5, and we'll have a SQL database as the backend for this. So I'm just going to call this Northwind. Actually, you know what? Let's call it Entity Framework Validation Demo. And let me make sure I put that in the right place here. Okay, and we'll create a very, very simple database. I'll just call this Northwind. And we'll keep this very simple just so we can portray all the points that I want to portray. We'll call this customers. No, actually, let's just call it people. Pretty generic. Okay, we're done with that. We don't really need much of anything else. So the next step is we're going to go to our package manager, and we're going to install the Entity Framework. And next we're going to add our EDMX model. I just want to blaze through all this boilerplate stuff. I assume you understand how to create a model and how to hook it up to a database and all that. Okay, now I want to start from the very beginning, completely toss out the concept of Entity Framework from the get-go. I want to introduce you to validation in Entity Framework without actually talking about Entity Framework itself. And we can do that because it's based off of two different interfaces. The first interface is IValidatableObject, and the second interface is IDataErrorInfo. IDataErrorInfo is more used for things like WPF, but it also works with Entity Framework. IValidatableObject is very similar. It's not supported by WPF, and it is supported by Entity Framework. I'm not really going to talk about the key differences between the two, but I can say immediately that IDataErrorInfo is property level validation, whereas IValidatableObject is more object level validation. You can still do everything with both. It's just the way the interfaces are structured. IDataErrorInfo is much more favorable for property level validation, whereas IValidatableObject is more favorable for object level validation as a whole. So the one interface that we're going to work with is IValidatableObject, and we're going to do that by taking our existing person class that we just generated from the T4 template, and we're going to implement a partial class file that implements the interface and all of our validation logic. So again, remember that this is outside the context of Entity Framework right now. We're not even talking about that. We're strictly in the realm of POCOs to do our validation. So we're going to add a new file to the project. This will just be a class file. And I'm going to call this person.business rules. I'm going to say it's partial class to our person, and they live in the same namespace. And we're going to implement our IValidatableObject interface, and this lives under system.componentModel.data annotations, which I believe you do need to add a reference to in your project. So if I actually, before I implement this, if we look at our references, you can see that we have that reference added, and that's actually because I installed the Entity Framework package from NuGet, so we get that automatically. So we're going to implement this interface, and we are going to go ahead and do our business logic here. And it's very straightforward. It takes a validation context as a parameter, and we'll explain that when we actually use this object. And it returns an IEnumerable of validation result. And if we look at the metadata for validation result, it's a pretty straightforward class. We have a static member variable determining whether it's successful or not. We have a couple constructors. We have an error message. And then we have an IEnumerable of string of member names. And these are actually the property names that were involved with the error, because you may have a business rule that relies on more than one property on the object, and you want to be able to specify what all properties were involved with that error back to the user. And that's what the member names property does. So let's go ahead and close out that. So now the way this works is we just need a list of validation results. We'll start with an empty list, and now we're actually going to do our business logic. So we want to say in our database that the first and last name columns are required. So we can do that, and just, by the way, just by required, I mean not empty. So even if we provide an empty string, that should be invalid. We should be able to say we want at least one or more characters in this string. So what we can do is we can say if string is null or white space, and we're going to pass in our first name property. We're going to say we're going to add a new validation result, and we're going to say that this validation result has an error message of first name cannot be null or empty. Now, because this is only a single property involved with this business rule, I'm not going to specify any member names. But if we had a business rule that relied on both the first and last name of the person, I could specify, a new string of all those property names. So I could say first name, last name, and we could do that. But for this particular rule, we don't need to do that. So we're going to go ahead and just remove that. Okay. Now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to say if string is null white space, last name, results add, new validation result, cannot be null or empty. Okay. And then what we'll do is we'll just return our results. So what's going to happen is if our object is valid and there's nothing wrong with it, it'll just return an empty list of results, meaning that there's no problems with our object. Otherwise, it will return however many validation errors actually happened. So now that we're done with that, let's put this in practice and go into our program. And let's declare a new person. And let's say that the first name is, again, we're going to break this because I want to show you how it works. So I'm going to specify an empty string, and then for the last name, I'm going to specify my last name. And then what we can do is because we implemented IValidatableObject on our person class, we can actually call the validate method. So I can say validation results is equal to person.validate, and it expects to have a validation context passed to it. So we're going to go ahead and provide that. And this has a couple different overloads, but essentially the only one that we need to work with is just the one where we actually provide our person object. Okay, so let's clean this up just a touch. We'll import our namespace that way. And now what we can do is we can actually enumerate over our results, and we can do something about that. So we can print these to the console. So we can take the result and we can print the error message, and optionally we can print the member names. Okay, so if we're to run this, it should just run real quick. If we check our output window, we should be able to see that we have our validation result. First name cannot be null or empty. And let's kind of bring this output window, bring it over here for now. So again, there you go, there's our validation result. So let's actually set a breakpoint on the beginning of our for each loop. Let's actually look at the collection that was returned by the validate method. You can see that it did return one validation result. And if we expand that, we can see the error message as well as any member names that were specified. So this is one unique way you can do validation, and you can use this interface for any object that you make, regardless of the technology. It's just an interface, but it's an interface that works with other frameworks within .NET like WCF and Entity Framework. So how does this play into Entity Framework? Let's take a look at that. Let's go back, and we'll leave the same exact thing. We're going to leave our person object as an invalid object, but we're going to go ahead and create an instance of our context, and we're going to go ahead and try and add our person to the people table. And we'll try and save the changes. And if we run this, let's see what happens. We can see that we get this DB entity validation exception was unhandled. And we can see we get this nice little error message that says validation failed. And the reason is we implemented the IValidatableObject interface on our person object. And what happens is when we call save changes, the data context or DB context automatically makes a call to the validate method and gets that collection of validation results. And if there's more than one, it's going to throw this exception and tell you that the entities were invalid. And it's not going to persist them to the database because there's something wrong with them. Now, this goes a lot further than just the interface. If we don't implement that interface, and let's say we have a column with a max width of 50, you will also get this exception, and we'll demonstrate that as well. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how you can leverage the power of Entity Framework and this interface to recover from this error and continue with this process. So we're actually going to wrap this in a try catch block. We're going to say catch DB entity validation exception. And if we look at the properties we get with the exception, you can see that we get a nice property called entity validation errors. Now this is not the same as our validation results. We can enumerate over this, however, and we can say var error and ex validation errors. And if we look at the object that's passed to us, we have the DB entity entry. We also have a property stating whether it's valid or not. And then we actually have a collection of the actual validation errors, which is, again, it's not the actual validation result, but it's wrapped by a DB entity validation result. So we can do this again. We could say for each validation error, and error, validation errors, and we could say, now we do have our properties that we want. We have our error message and our property name. Now this is slightly different than the validation result object we talked about earlier. This isn't an array of strings with property names. This is just a single string property. But if you do have multiple properties that you specified through that array, you will get all those properties in this single property name property. Lots of redundancy. So at this point, we can say, what if we wanted to continue saving our changes? What if we had an instance where we had a person 1, and what if we had a person 2? And what if our person 2 is a valid person? What if we had, oh heck, we'll just use Bill Gates as an example. Bill's name equals Gates. Okay, so in this instance, person 2 is going to be a valid object because we specified both the first and last name. And person 1, we're still specifying an empty string, so they will be invalid. So if we add both of these people to the context for insert, and we try to save changes, what's going to happen is this will call the validate method on both these objects, and it's going to fail because person 1 is invalid. And that's actually going to stop the context from persisting any changes, which includes person 2. But because we actually get this notification, we can handle that, and we can mitigate that problem by actually removing the invalid entities from the context. So what we're going to do here is we're going to print out any validation errors. So we're just going to print out the error message to the console, and then we're going to say debug print, and then we'll say, let's see, error entry, and we'll go ahead and say entity toString was removed from the context, so the rest can be persistent. Okay, pretty long message, but we'll get the point. And to simplify this even further, let's go to our person class real quick, and let's just override toString, and we'll return string format, and we'll just say first name, last name. Okay. So, and the next thing we can do is we can say db, and we want to say, actually, we can do this directly through the exception. It provides us all the information we need. So we actually have the validation error, and we could say entry, state, and then we could detach it from the context. So it's no longer, at this point, being tracked by the context, and it's no longer marked for insert. So if we debug this, let's hit our breakpoint. We can see that our entry, or the state of our entry, is actually set to added, because that's what we wanted to do initially, is we wanted to add this to the context and have it inserted in the database. So what we're doing by setting its state to detached is we're saying we no longer want this added, and we no longer want it tracked by the data context. So now that we have it detached, we can actually, and this would be an okay case where you could probably use a goto statement and get away with it, and we'll just do this for the sake of the example. Normally, I would advise against using goto, but I really just want to demonstrate this without overwhelming you with a whole lot of code. So we're going to say try save will be our label, and we're going to say goto try save. So what's going to happen here is we have this try save label. So the first time we call save changes, it's going to fail. We already know that because the first entity is invalid. But we're going to do something about that, and we're actually going to remove that entity from the context, and then we're going to try to save our changes again, in which the second attempt should succeed, but with only our second person. So let's go ahead and run this. And unable to, this is an interesting error. Let's see here. Because the defining query has no insert function. I've actually never seen this particular error message before, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the video and figure this one out, and then come back and I'll explain what happened, and we'll move forward with the demo from there. Alright, it actually only took me a moment. I realized that we forgot to set a primary key in our database structure, so let's go ahead and stop debugging this real quick. And we also forgot to set the identity for the primary key as well. So we're going to set ID as the primary key. We'll set the identity specification. Okay. So we should run this and we should... Oops. One more thing. Got to update our EDMX file so we have the proper metadata. Update model from database. These should not be entity keys. That should be an entity key. Okay, there we go. So now if we go to our database, we should have person 2 persisted in our people table. And there we go. So we have Bill Gates persisted in our people table. So, as you can see, very powerful. We were able to catch our validation errors with our objects. So let's say we're building an import process or something like that, or you can apply this really to anything. We can catch our validation problems and recover from that. So we don't have to break what we're trying to do just because something is invalid. So that's specifically the power of this interface. Now, what I want to cover now is what we talked about earlier, and I said that we can use the power of Entity Framework's validation to validate the column lengths and data types without having to actually implement the interface. And that's what we're going to do next. So let's go back to our business rules partial class, and let's do this real quick. Let's actually go to our database, leave that open, and let's actually modify our people table, and let's add a third column aside from the primary key, and let's go ahead and call this email, and let's say that this can only be (320) characters. If I remember correctly, and this might not be the exact number, but it's around there, that's the maximum standardized value for an email address in web browsers and things like that. It may have changed. Okay, and because our person does not have an email specified, let's go ahead and say Bill Gates. Let's go ahead and add an email form in the database so we can demonstrate this. We'll just say it's bgates@microsoft.com. Okay, and let's also say that now we don't want to allow nulls for the email address. So not only is our email going to be a required field, but it also has a max value of 320 characters. So now we need to go ahead and update our EDMX. And we have our email property. And we need to rerun our T4 templates. And I just want to make mention, because I know T4 templates are still not as widely used as a lot of people would think, but T4 templates, the reason we're doing the partial class outside of the T4 template is so each time we generate our objects from the EDMX file, we're not having our business rules overwritten by any designer generated code. So now that we've added this column, let's say our business rule is we do require an email because it's a non-nullable database column, but let's not add that as business rule in our person class. So what we can do is let's do the same thing. We'll simplify this quite a bit. Let's remove all our try-save stuff just for the sake of this. I want to simplify everything if we can. Now we know we have Bill Gates floating around in our database, so let's go ahead and say because we know he's in there. Okay. Now what we want to do is let's actually modify his email, and let's say that it's null, which you can do because in C# a string is a reference type, and we can do that. But in our database we can't do that. So what we should get here though is we should still get a DB entity validation exception. And we can see that if we dig into this a little bit, that we have one validation error. And let's dig into this a different way. Let's go to our locals window. And we can see the email field is required. Now this didn't come from us implementing any sort of business rule in our partial class. This came strictly from the database, because under the hood what's happening is this is actually a SQL error. So immediately this becomes very powerful because we don't need to implement business rules or validation in code for every little thing. We can let the database handle what it handles best. The database already knows that this column in this table has a maximum value. It already knows that this column in this table can be null or non-null. We don't need to validate those. We simply need to catch those in our code and do something about it. So what we can do is we can say we can actually say we'll say if it's equal to email, right? And I'm just going to get the message real quick. And you would probably never do this in a production system. You would never hard code what I'm about to do. I'm just doing this for the sake of teaching you how to work with this very easily. So we're going to say that if the email was for some reason null or empty, we're going to go ahead and fix that. So we're going to say email, and let's just say that we're going to default it to bgates@microsoft.com. And then we'll, right now we have change tracking enabled in any framework, so it's going to say that Bill Gates is modified, and now we can try to save the changes again. And there we go. So if we go back to our database and we run this, we could say that that's still there. And to show you that this works, we could change this to a different default value. Let's say that this is generic user at Microsoft.com, and we'll run that. Now if we go back to our database and select that, now we can see that we have generic user at Microsoft.com. So we didn't have to break execution of our program. We didn't have to expect the user to do something extra. We were able to actually handle the validation errors and just do something about it. Now there are times where you're going to ask the user for input again, and you can do that, but the whole point of this is that using validation in Entity Framework in conjunction with the IValidatableObject interface, you really have a rich, powerful set of tools to be able to solve these types of problems. So that's it. I'm going to go ahead and stop there for now. We've reached about our 30-minute threshold. So let me know what you think. There's a lot more you can do with Entity Framework. The next video, what I would like to talk about is performance. How can we get acceptable high performance with Entity Framework comparable to like raw ADO.NET using SQL commands and SQL connections? I'll tell you right now, it is possible. I've done it, and I will teach you how. There's a few tricks, a few things you need to know about Entity Framework, and like I said though, that'll have to be in the next video. So let me know what you think. Post in the comments, email me, message me, whatever you want. I'd like to know what you want to know, and we'll go from there. Have a great weekend.